On my 68th birthday, my own son told me I was nothing but a burden unworthy of a real inheritance. I never expected to spend this milestone sleeping on a stranger's couch, clutching the rusty key to what my late husband Bill had left me in his will, a basement in the old industrial district. Yet here I was, 3 weeks after Bill's funeral, with nowhere else to go and tears streaming down my weathered cheeks. The day had started with such hope. I'd woken in what I still thought of as my home, the elegant townhouse overlooking the harbor that Bill and I had shared for 38 years of marriage. I'd made coffee in our kitchen, the same ritual we'd shared for decades, straightened the family photos in the hallway one last time, and waited for my son David to arrive with the attorney. Those photos told the story of our life together, David's graduation from business school, our silver anniversary, family vacations when he was still young enough to smile genuinely in pictures. When had that smile become the calculated expression he wore now? Just a formality, Mom, David had assured me the week before, his designer suit immaculate as always, his tone carrying that practiced patience he used with difficult clients. Dad's will is straightforward. We'll get everything sorted, and then we can discuss your living arrangements going forward. Living arrangements going forward. Even then, something in his phrasing should have warned me. Not where you'd like to live or how to make you comfortable, but arrangements, as if I were a problem to be managed efficiently. The reading at Jameson and Associates passed in a blur of legal terminology and formal procedures. Mr. Jameson, who had handled our family's affairs for decades, seemed unusually uncomfortable as he adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat repeatedly. I remember thinking he looked older than his years, worn down by decades of delivering news that changed lives forever. The formal language washed over me like a tide I couldn't resist until certain phrases cut through my grief with the precision of surgical instruments. To my son, David Michael Harrison, I leave the townhouse at 47 Harbor View Drive in the primary investment portfolio, including all stocks, bonds, and liquid assets totaling approximately $2.3 million. My heart began that slow, heavy rhythm of approaching dread. And to my beloved wife, Margaret Rose Harrison, I leave the property located at 1247 Industrial Lane, the basement storage facility and all its contents. A basement. After 38 years of marriage, 23 years of caring for Bill through his various health scares, countless nights spent nursing him through treatments and recoveries, sitting beside his hospital bed while machines beeped his life force into the sterile air, after all of that, Bill had left me a basement in the warehouse district. David's face transformed instantly from practiced solemnity to barely concealed satisfaction. I watched it happen in slow motion, the slight widening of his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders, the way his hands settled on my shoulder with fingers that pressed just slightly too hard. "Don't worry, Mom," he'd whispered, his breath carrying the scent of expensive cologne and morning coffee. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." The condescension in those words landed like ice in my chest. Taken care of, as if I were a child or an invalid rather than the woman who had managed our household finances for 4 decades. That evening, as David drove me back to Harbor View Drive, I sat in the passenger seat of his BMW, watching familiar streets blur past through tears I was trying not to shed. The townhouse looked the same as always, elegant brick facade, the garden I'd tended for 15 years, the blue front door Bill had painted himself because he said it reminded him of my eyes. But everything felt different now. The house was no longer mine, would never be mine again. I was a guest in the place I'd called home for decades. David set my single suitcase down in our foyer, the same foyer where I'd welcomed guests for decades, where I'd hung Bill's coat every evening when he returned from work, where we'd posed for family photos that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. "I think it would be best if you found somewhere else to stay tonight, Mom," David announced, his tone businesslike and efficient. "I have contractors coming tomorrow morning to start the renovations, and they need complete access." I stared at him, not immediately comprehending. "Renovations? But this is my home, David. Our home. Actually, it's my home now." His voice carried that same rehearsed quality he used in real estate negotiations, polished smooth by years of practice. "The will was very clear about that. And I need to maximize its value. The place is dated, and the market won't wait for sentiment. But where am I supposed to go?" The question came out small and bewildered, the voice of a woman who'd never imagined her own child would make her homeless. David shrugged, the gesture dismissive in its casualness. You could stay with your sister Helen for a while. She's got that big house in the suburbs, and it's not like she's using all those bedrooms. He paused, and I caught something cruel flickering in his expression. Or there's always that basement Dad left you. Though why he left you that worthless storage space is beyond me. What are you going to do, become a hoarder at your age? His laugh held a sharp edge that I'd never heard directed at me before. It was the laugh he used in business when someone had made a particularly naive suggestion. Something fundamental shifted inside me then, some foundation that had supported me for nearly 7 decades beginning to crumble. David, this is my home. Your father and I built a life here. Surely you don't expect me to just pack up and leave tonight? It's not your home anymore, Mom. His voice hardened with each word, taking on that flat, final tone he used to end difficult conversations. It's mine. Dad made that perfectly clear in his will. And honestly, you're lucky he left you anything at all. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I reached for the banister to steady myself, my legs suddenly unsteady. I just need time to understand this, to find somewhere appropriate to, time? David interrupted, checking his expensive watch with theatrical impatience. You've had 3 weeks since the funeral to figure this out. I can't put my life on hold indefinitely because you refuse to face reality. That's when he said the words that would echo in my mind as I drove aimlessly through the city hours later, eventually finding myself parked outside a run-down building in the industrial district, staring at a rusty door marked with the number 1247. You're just a useless old woman, Mom. Dad knew that. That's why he left you a basement instead of anything valuable. At least now I can stop pretending you're capable of managing real responsibilities. The cruelty was so unexpected, so completely at odds with the son I thought I'd raised, that I couldn't even formulate a response. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. I simply stood there, absorbing the impact, until I finally managed to pick up my suitcase with hands that shook slightly. Have you ever felt the ground disappear beneath your feet when someone you love reveals who they truly are? If this story touches something in your heart, share it with other women who might need to know they're not alone in facing family betrayal. Subscribe so we can continue sharing stories of strength and survival together. I took my purse and the key Mr. Jameson had pressed into my hand after the reading, a key that felt impossibly heavy for something so small, and walked out into the cold October evening. Now, standing before the dented metal door marked 1247, I fumbled with unfamiliar locks in the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. The neighborhood around me was deserted, filled with empty warehouses and the occasional homeless encampment. Graffiti covered most of the visible walls, and broken glass crunched under my feet as I approached the door. This was where my loving husband of 38 years had decided I belonged. My arthritic fingers, stiff from the cold and stress, finally managed to turn the key. The door groaned open on protesting hinges, releasing not the musty dampness I'd expected but something else entirely, leather, maybe, and a faint hint of something floral that reminded me of the potpourri I used to keep in our bedroom. I stepped into absolute darkness, my phone's flashlight creating a thin beam that seemed swallowed by the space beyond. As my eyes adjusted, I realized this wasn't the cramped storage unit I'd imagined. The ceiling stretched high above me, disappearing into shadow, and my footsteps echoed in what seemed like a much larger space than the narrow door had suggested. The air felt different too, not stale or abandoned, but somehow maintained, as if this place had been cared for recently. That's when my light caught something that made me freeze in place, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be what Bill had meant when he'd left me, the basement and its contents. But there, gleaming in the beam of my phone's light like something from a dream, was something that would change everything I thought I knew about my inheritance, my late husband, and the son who'd called me worthless just hours before. My phone trembled in my shaking hand as I stared at what couldn't possibly be real. There, arranged with museum-like precision in the center of the basement, stood not one, but 3 glass display cases that belonged in a high-end gallery. And inside each case, jewelry that caught my flashlight beam like trapped starfire, pieces so exquisite they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The first case held what appeared to be a complete set of vintage Van Cleef & Arpels, a necklace that looked like golden flowers blooming around emeralds the size of grapes, matching earrings that caught the light in a dozen different ways, and a bracelet so delicate and perfectly crafted it might have been spun from precious metal and dreams. The second displayed an Art Deco diamond tiara that belonged in a palace, its geometric patterns creating prismatic rainbows even in my phone's weak light. The third contained something that made my heart stop entirely, a collection of Faberge pieces, including what looked like one of those legendary imperial Easter eggs I'd only ever seen in museums. "This can't be real," I whispered to the empty space, my voice echoing strangely in the darkness. "Bill, what on earth were you thinking?" But as I moved closer to examine the cases, everything about them screamed authenticity. The lighting fixtures were professional grade, the kind used in museums and high-end galleries. I could hear the soft hum of climate control systems working in the background, and as my eyes adjusted further, I began to notice security features built seamlessly into the walls, motion sensors, cameras, even what looked like a sophisticated alarm system with a small control panel near the entrance. This wasn't some fantasy or desperate hallucination brought on by stress and grief. This was real, meticulously planned, and obviously expensive. I fumbled along the wall until I found a light switch. The sudden brilliance that flooded the basement made me gasp aloud and shield my eyes. What I had taken for a dingy storage facility was actually a sophisticated showroom that would have impressed the curators at the Metropolitan Museum. The concrete floors had been polished to a mirror finish and covered with antique Persian rugs. The walls were painted a warm cream color and lined with additional display cases I hadn't seen in the darkness. And everywhere I looked, there were treasures that took my breath away. One wall held vintage Hermès handbags in pristine condition, Kelly bags, Birkin bags, limited editions I recognized from magazine articles about auctions where they sold for tens of thousands of dollars. Another section displayed what appeared to be first edition books, their leather bindings gleaming under the specialized lighting. I caught titles by Dickens, Austen, Hemingway, all in what looked like their original bindings with gilt lettering that hadn't faded after decades or even centuries. In one corner stood an entire collection devoted to antique silver, tea services that gleamed like captured moonlight, candelabras that belonged on the tables of European royalty, serving pieces so ornate and detailed they qualified as sculpture. Crystal glasses caught the light like captured rainbows, throwing tiny spectrums across the cream-colored walls. And in the center of it all, a small sitting area with two leather chairs that looked like they'd come from an English gentleman's club, positioned around a side table where someone, Bill, had clearly spent time contemplating this incredible collection. I sank into one of the chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. After 38 years of marriage, I had thought I knew everything about Bill Harrison. He had been practical, methodical, careful with money but never extravagant. He'd driven the same reliable sedan for 15 years, worn the same watch for 20, and complained about the cost of replacing anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I remembered him questioning every significant purchase we made, whether we really needed to replace the living room furniture, whether the vacation to Europe was truly within our budget, whether we should really spend money on name-brand groceries when store brands were perfectly adequate. Yet here, hidden beneath the city like some secret treasure cave from a fairy tale, was evidence of a completely different man. A man who appreciated beauty on a profound level, who understood true value in ways I'd never suspected, who had spent years, perhaps decades, carefully acquiring pieces that belonged in the world's finest museums and private collections. That's when I noticed the envelope propped against the lamp on the side table, my name written across it in Bill's unmistakable handwriting, the same careful script he'd used to write grocery lists and birthday cards, now carrying a message that would change everything. With fingers that still trembled, I broke the wax seal and unfolded several pages of my husband's careful script written on his personal stationery, the expensive kind he'd always claimed was too good for everyday use. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've discovered my greatest secret and my final gift to you. I know you must be confused, perhaps even hurt by the way I've structured my will. Please know that every decision was made with love and the most careful consideration for your future and well-being." I paused, pressing the letter against my chest, feeling Bill's presence in every word. Even in death, he was still taking care of me, still thinking ahead to my needs in ways I was only beginning to understand. For the past 15 years, I continued reading, ever since my first heart attack gave me a preview of mortality, I've been quietly building this collection. Not as a hobby, my love, but as insurance, the most beautiful and practical insurance policy I could create for the woman I love more than life itself. I remembered that first heart attack. Bill had been 53, seemingly healthy, when he'd collapsed in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning. The doctors had said stress, poor diet, genetics, the usual culprits. But what I remembered most was how the experience had changed him, made him more thoughtful about time, more deliberate about planning for the future. I watched how David changed as he became successful in his career, the letter continued, how he began to view everything and everyone in terms of their utility to him, their contribution to his goals and ambitions. I saw how he dismissed your opinions, your contributions, your wisdom, the very things that have sustained our marriage and made our life together so rich. The accuracy of Bill's observation struck me like a physical blow. I had made excuses for David's behavior for years, telling myself he was just busy, just focused on his career, just going through a phase that successful young men sometimes experience. But Bill had seen it clearly, the gradual erosion of respect, the increasing dismissiveness, the way David had begun to treat me like an obligation rather than his mother. I knew that if something happened to me, he would see you as nothing more than an obligation to be managed as efficiently as possible. A problem to be solved with the least possible inconvenience to his life and plans. David hadn't waited 24 hours to prove his father's assessment devastatingly correct. So I created this collection. Each piece has been carefully chosen not just for its beauty, though I hope you find them beautiful, but for its investment value and, crucially, for its complexity. Margaret, these aren't instantly liquid assets that can be quickly converted to cash. They require authentication, proper documentation, careful handling, and strategic timing to realize their full value. Hasty sales could cost you 30% or more in fees, taxes, and reduced market value. I looked around the basement with new understanding. This wasn't just a collection, it was a sophisticated financial instrument disguised as beautiful objects. The jewelry alone has been appraised at approximately $6 million, Bill's letter explained, but only if sold properly, through the right channels, with proper authentication and marketing. The books add another $1.5 million. Some are worth more than our townhouse, but only to the right collectors. The silver, crystal, and handbags bring the total to approximately $8 million. $8 million. I read the figure twice, then a third time, unable to fully process the magnitude of what Bill had created in secret. But even more staggering was the thought and planning that had gone into each piece, the years of careful acquisition, the meticulous attention to documentation and preservation. You'll find complete documentation for each item in the filing cabinet beside the desk, Bill's letter explained. Provenance papers, insurance appraisals, certificates of authenticity, purchase records, everything you'll need to prove ownership and value. I've also included contact information for Isabella Fontaine, a specialist in high-end estate sales who has been helping me with acquisitions for the past decade. She knows the full extent of the collection and understands the complexities involved in liquidating pieces if you choose that path. I rose from the chair and found the filing cabinet, which opened to reveal folders organized with the same meticulous care Bill had brought to everything in his life. Each piece in the collection had its own file, complete with purchase records, authentication certificates, insurance appraisals, and detailed photographs taken from multiple angles. The documentation was thorough, professional, and absolutely legitimate. But it was the final paragraph of Bill's letter that brought tears to my eyes once again. I know our son will likely react poorly when he discovers the extent of what I've left you. His inheritance was carefully calculated to provide him with comfort and status, enough to maintain his lifestyle and fund his ambitions, but not unlimited power over your circumstances or unlimited access to family wealth. You see, my love, I wanted to give you what I couldn't provide during our marriage while I was focused on building our security through conventional means, complete freedom to live your life exactly as you choose, beholden to no one, dependent on no one's goodwill or generosity. I sank back into the leather chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Bill had done. All those years of careful budgeting, of questioning purchases that seemed extravagant, of presenting himself as a simple, practical man who valued security over beauty, it had all been a carefully constructed cover for this elaborate plan to ensure my complete independence. I thought about David's words just hours earlier. You're just a useless old woman. The cruelty of it seemed almost absurd now, sitting surrounded by treasures that represented more wealth than David would likely accumulate in his entire career, no matter how successful he became. But what struck me most profoundly wasn't the money, impressive as it was. It was the love behind it, the deep, abiding love of a man who had seen what I had been too kind, too accommodating, too hopeful to acknowledge, that our son had grown into someone who valued people only for what they could provide him, who saw relationships as transactions and family members as resources to be managed. And rather than hoping David might change or trying to force a different relationship between them, Bill had simply ensured that I would never be dependent on David's goodwill, never vulnerable to his moods or decisions, never capable of being discarded like an inconvenience. As I sat in the quiet basement, surrounded by beauty and security I had never dreamed possible, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just hope, but actual power. For the first time since Bill's diagnosis 3 years ago, I wasn't merely reacting to circumstances beyond my control. I had choices, real, meaningful choices about how to live the rest of my life. The question was, what would I do with this unexpected gift? And how long before David discovered that his useless old mother was actually wealthier than he could ever imagine? The next morning, I woke in the most comfortable bed I'd slept in since Bill's death. The small apartment above the basement was like something from a luxury hotel, Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like silk against my skin, a kitchenette stocked with gourmet coffee and artisanal preserves, and windows that had been specially treated to look grimy and abandoned from the outside while remaining crystal clear from within. Even in creating this secret sanctuary, Bill had thought of every detail. As I sipped my coffee and looked down at the treasure room below through a cleverly disguised one-way mirror in the apartment floor, I found Isabella Fontaine's business card among Bill's carefully organized papers. Her credentials were impressive: former senior curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, now one of the most respected private dealers in fine art and jewelry in the country, with clients ranging from tech billionaires to European royalty. When I called her number at 9 a.m. sharp, she answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Harrison," she said before I could even introduce myself, her voice carrying a warm French accent that immediately put me at ease. "I've been expecting your call for 3 weeks now. William told me you might need some time to process everything before reaching out." "You knew about all this?" I asked, gesturing helplessly at the collection spread below me, even though she couldn't see my movements. "Darling, I helped him acquire most of it over the past 10 years. Your husband was one of the most methodical and knowledgeable collectors I've ever worked with. Every piece was chosen not just for its beauty, but for its investment potential, its market liquidity, and its ability to retain value through economic uncertainty." Her voice softened with genuine affection. "He loved you very much, you know. Every single acquisition was made with your future security and independence in mind." Within an hour, Isabella arrived at the basement facility in a nondescript van that gave no hint of the expertise and resources it contained. She was exactly as her voice had suggested, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that somehow made her look both sophisticated and approachable, dressed in a simple but perfectly tailored black dress that spoke of understated wealth and impeccable taste. She moved through the collection with the reverence of someone who truly understood what she was seeing, occasionally stopping to examine a piece more closely, her trained eye catching details that would be invisible to most people. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, examining the Faberge egg through its display case with a jeweler's loupe. "I remember when William found this piece, it was being sold by a family who had no idea what they possessed. They thought it was a reproduction, perhaps worth a few $100s at most. Your husband spent 6 months having it authenticated by 3 different experts before making the purchase." 6 months? I watched her work, fascinated by the depth of her knowledge. "He never mentioned any of this to me. I had no idea he was even interested in antiques or collectibles." Isabella looked up from her examination, her expression gentle but knowing. "He said you would have worried about the expense, tried to talk him out of what you would have seen as frivolous purchases. He wanted to build your security without burdening you with the stress and uncertainty of the process." She was absolutely right, of course. If I had known Bill was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on jewelry and art, I would have been terrified. I had always been the practical one in our marriage, worried about having enough for emergencies, for unexpected medical bills, for the inevitable crises that life brings to everyone if they live long enough. What did he tell you about our son David? I found myself asking. Isabella's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that spoke volumes about her professional discretion and personal opinion. He was deeply concerned about your son's attitude toward money and, more importantly, toward you. William felt that David had come to see people as assets to be managed rather than individuals to be cherished and respected. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He mentioned that David had made some comments about your capabilities and your role in the family that were dismissive and hurtful. I thought about David's cruel words the night before, his casual dismissal of me as a useless old woman. Bill had seen it all, had been watching our son's character erode over years while I had made excuses and tried to smooth over the increasingly rough edges of our family dynamics. There's something else, Isabella continued, pulling a small, ornate key from her purse. William left this with me, along with very specific instructions that I should only give it to you after you'd had sufficient time to absorb the initial discovery and understand its implications. She handed me the key, which was noticeably smaller and newer than the one that had opened the basement door. He said to tell you that it opens what he called the real truth. The real truth? I stared at the key in my palm, my mind racing. If the $8 million worth of artifacts surrounding us wasn't the real truth, then what was? Isabella smiled at my obvious confusion. Check the far wall, behind the collection of business books. William said you'd know what to do when you were ready to face whatever comes next. After she left, promising to return the following week to discuss my options for managing or liquidating the collection, I stood before the wall of first edition books, running my fingers along their leather spines. Most were classics, Dickens, Austen, Hemingway, Tolstoy, the kind of literature that Bill and I had both loved and discussed during the early years of our marriage. But one section seemed oddly out of place among the literary masterpieces: contemporary business books, real estate investment guides, financial planning manuals. That's when I noticed it. One book, The Intelligent Investor, by Benjamin Graham, protruded slightly from the shelf, as if it had been recently handled. When I pulled it, the entire section of business books swung inward like a door, revealing a small office space I hadn't known existed. Inside was a modern desk equipped with a computer and multiple monitors, filing cabinets that made the documentation in the main basement look sparse by comparison, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment, cameras, recording devices, and communication equipment that belonged in a private detective's office rather than a collector's basement. But it was what hung on the walls of this hidden office that made my breath catch in my throat and my hands begin to shake. Photographs. Dozens of them, all featuring David in various business situations, but not the kind of photos a proud father would display. These were surveillance images. David shaking hands with clients while a telephoto lens captured documents on the table behind them. David at business dinners, his face animated with laughter while others at the table looked uncomfortable, concerned, or even frightened. David in heated conversations outside office buildings, his body language aggressive and intimidating, his finger pointed at people who seemed to be backing away from him. David meeting with men in expensive suits who had the unmistakable look of people who solved problems that legitimate businesses couldn't handle through normal channels. I sank into the desk chair, my hands shaking as I began to understand what I was looking at. Bill hadn't just been concerned about David's attitude toward me or his casual dismissiveness of my worth as a person. My husband had been conducting a full-scale investigation into our son's business practices, and what he had discovered was far worse than simple selfishness or ingratitude. The filing cabinets were organized by year, going back nearly a decade. Each folder contained evidence of increasingly questionable and ultimately criminal dealings, partnerships that had gone sour under highly suspicious circumstances, clients who had filed formal complaints that were later mysteriously withdrawn, investors who had trusted David with substantial portions of their life savings only to see their money disappear into failed projects and fraudulent schemes. The most recent folder was labeled simply, Current Crisis, in Bill's careful handwriting. Inside, I found documents that explained everything about David's current financial situation in devastating detail. The penthouse renovations that had supposedly gone over budget due to unexpected structural problems hadn't encountered any structural problems at all. David had been systematically diverting funds from the renovation budget to cover losses from a real estate investment scheme that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own fraud. But it was the final document in the folder that made my blood run cold and my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the papers. A contract, signed by David just 2 months before Bill's death, pledging our family townhouse, the home where I had lived for decades, the home that was supposed to be David's inheritance, as collateral for a loan from what the paperwork euphemistically called a private lending consortium, but which charged 18% monthly interest. David hadn't just been planning to inherit the house. He had already promised it to dangerous people to cover debts that he had no way of paying through legitimate means. A handwritten note from Bill was paperclipped to the contract, and reading it felt like hearing my husband's voice from beyond the grave. "Margaret, our son isn't just selfish or immature. He has become genuinely dangerous to anyone who trusts him with money, property, or personal safety. This inheritance structure isn't just about providing for your future, it's about protecting you from the consequences of his criminal behavior and the people he's chosen to associate with." I sat in that small, secret room for hours, reading through years of evidence that painted a picture of a man I barely recognized as the boy I had raised with such love and hope. David hadn't just become dismissive or entitled over the years. He had systematically transformed himself into a predator who used family connections and inherited trust to fund increasingly desperate and illegal financial gambles. The worst part was the timeline. Bill had discovered the loan shark contract in late February. He had died in March. The timing couldn't possibly be coincidental, and I found myself wondering if the stress of discovering what our son had become had contributed to Bill's final heart attack. My hands trembling with a combination of grief and rage, I turned on the computer. Bill had left it logged into an email account I had never known existed, and the messages it contained were even more devastating than the physical evidence. Communications with attorneys about emergency changes to his will, urgent instructions to Isabella about accelerating certain purchases to get assets into my name before David could claim them, and most damning of all, an exchange with a private investigator about ensuring Margaret's physical safety and financial security when David discovers the extent of his disinheritance and the evidence we've compiled against him. Bill hadn't just foreseen David's reaction to the will, he had been actively afraid of it. Afraid enough to hire security consultants, to create this elaborate hidden sanctuary, to ensure that I had not just financial resources but a safe place to retreat when David's true nature finally emerged completely. The phone rang, startling me out of my horrified reverie. David's number flashed on the screen, and for the first time since his cruel dismissal the night before, I felt something other than hurt or confusion. I felt genuine fear, not just of financial manipulation or emotional cruelty, but of what David might be capable of when he discovered that his carefully laid plans had been completely destroyed by his father's foresight. But underneath that fear, something else was growing. Something harder and more determined than I had ever felt before. Something that had been building since the moment David had called me a useless old woman and thrown me out of my own home. "Hello, David," I answered, my voice steadier than I had expected. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice carried a tension I hadn't heard the night before, an edge that suggested his facade of control was beginning to crack. "I've been thinking about Dad's will, and some things aren't adding up. I think there might be assets that weren't disclosed during the reading." Of course he was getting suspicious. Bill had predicted this too, had prepared for exactly this conversation. "What kind of assets?" I asked, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. "I found some old bank statements in Dad's study, references to accounts I don't recognize. Wire transfers to companies I've never heard of. And that basement he left you, I drove by this morning to take a look." His voice took on that calculating tone I'd heard him use in business negotiations. "The building looks abandoned from the outside, but there are some very expensive security features visible if you know what to look for. Motion sensors, high-end cameras, climate control systems. That doesn't make sense for a simple storage unit." I looked around at the evidence of Bill's investigation, at the proof of David's criminal associations, at the elaborate surveillance and protection system my husband had created to keep me safe from our own son. "Why don't you come by tomorrow morning?" I heard myself saying, my voice calm and controlled in a way that surprised me. "We should definitely discuss this in person." "Tomorrow morning?" "Mom, this is urgent." His voice took on that demanding tone I'd heard so often in recent years. I'm facing some serious financial pressures right now, and if there are additional family assets that I should know about, I need that information immediately. Financial pressures. Such a polite way to describe loan shark debts and the kind of criminal fraud charges that were probably closing in on him even as we spoke. Tomorrow, David, I repeated, my voice firm in a way it hadn't been in years. 10 o'clock sharp. And David? I paused, letting the silence stretch between us. Come alone. After I hung up, I sat back in Bill's secret office, surrounded by evidence of our son's crimes and my husband's desperate attempts to protect me from them. Tomorrow, David would learn the truth about the basement and its contents. But he would also learn something else, something Bill's meticulous investigation had made crystal clear. His useless old mother knew exactly who he really was. And she was no longer afraid of him. The question now wasn't whether David deserved to know about the inheritance Bill had prepared for me. The question was whether I could use that knowledge, and the evidence Bill had compiled, to ensure that David faced appropriate consequences for what he had become, while protecting myself from whatever retaliation he might attempt. Bill had given me more than financial security and beautiful objects to appreciate. He had given me power, real power backed by evidence and resources. Tomorrow, I would find out just how ready I was to use it. But first, I had some phone calls to make. Starting with a certain private investigator whose contact information I'd found among Bill's files, and a security consultant who specialized in protecting people from their own family members. The useless old woman David had dismissed was about to show him just how dangerously wrong he had been about everything. The next morning, I found myself pacing the polished floor of Bill's secret sanctuary, waiting for the sound of my son's footsteps. My heart thundered in my chest, not with fear, but with the strange mixture of dread and hope that comes only before the most important conversations of a lifetime. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy door creaked open, and David stepped inside. He wore his usual uniform of control, a pressed suit, a silk tie knotted too tightly, a cologne that announced him before his words ever did. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted to the display cases, to the museum-like order of treasures his father had curated, then back to me. Suspicion warred with greed, calculation with unease. "Mom," he began, his voice clipped, the practiced tone of a man used to bending others to his will. "What is this place? What did Dad leave you?" Instead of answering, I slid the envelope across the table toward him. Bill's handwriting, steady and unmistakable, stared up at my son. For a moment, David didn't move. Then, slowly, he picked it up. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal, though he tried to disguise it with a sharp breath. I watched his eyes scan the pages. At first, there was irritation, his lip curled at the details of my inheritance, his jaw tightened at the careful strategies Bill had outlined. Then something shifted. The lines between his brows deepened. His mouth parted as though the words had punched the air from his chest. When he reached the paragraphs where Bill spoke of him, of the selfishness, the arrogance, the cruelty he feared would consume him, David's face went pale. He slammed the letter shut and tossed it back onto the table. "He didn't understand me," he said, his voice sharp, defensive. "He always underestimated what it takes to survive in the real world." "Did he?" I asked quietly. My voice wasn't angry, it was steady, almost calm. "Or did he know you better than you want to admit?" David turned away, pacing, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair until it stood in uneven ridges. "You think I wanted to hurt you?" His words came fast, desperate. I was under pressure, debts, expectations, deals that went bad. "You wouldn't understand." "I understand more than you think," I interrupted. My voice rose for the first time, echoing off the polished walls. "I understand what it feels like to sacrifice for someone, to give everything you have for decades, and then be told you're nothing. Do you know how it feels for your own child to call you useless?"